here. My accent is English. So happens I live in Ireland, and try and be thank you very much, a loyal European by having a company operating in companies operating in Italy, in Spain, and in Norway. And as a boy, I was actually brought up in Germany. So when talking about the past history of privatization and state enterprise restructuring, I would make the point that it is important to look back over time and look forward to the future. Because I remember clearly in August 1961 when the Berlin Wall was being constructed. That shows you that I'm a recycled teenager, but I thought it might be useful to put up some of these reminders, especially for those of us around here who are under the age of 40, because so much has changed in Europe in the last 20 years. I won't really go into the many details of it, but I would say that it is valuable to consider the long-term perspective whenever one is looking at state enterprise restructuring and the whole reform program of the public sector, because it is the long term which counts, not the short-term changes. So therefore, particularly in Europe, if one is looking at the experience in Europe, one cannot overlook the past tensions. I mentioned the Berlin Wall, there's the 1968 invasion by Russia of Czechoslovakia. But I think it might be also useful just to remember that nationalization and privatization have quite a long history. While back in India, it may be worth just recalling that possibly the first privatization was the East India, the first nationalization was actually the East India Company. And that still has memories because I think in the Kochi shipyard was actually built by the East India Company over 200 years ago. So it has some resonance. But I think very often privatization is associated, first of all, with the Chicago boys in Chile, and then with Margaret Thatcher. But I think it's worth recalling that if one talks to Europe, especially if one speaks to people in Germany, one has memories there of the nationalizations and the privatizations in Germany and Italy after the First World War in 1918 and at the time of the Great Depression. In those days, Germany nationalized the banks. So Deutsche Bank, Dresdner Bank, Commerzbank were all state-owned. Quite a change. But then they were then privatized by the Nazi Party after 1934. There's some debate about the reasons and the purposes, but looking at the literature and hearing what I was taught as a fairly young boy, the main purpose was to raise money. Because the Nazi Party in Germany in 1934 did have a severe fiscal deficit and public sector financial problems, and selling off the state-owned companies was a rapid and easy way to raise cash. So there's a lot of history, and that history resonates in parts of Europe. It's also worthwhile remembering that Volkswagen was part privatized in 1961, 20 years before Thatcher. So there's a lot of history and a lot of memories, and if one thinks back to the experiences in the Weimar Republic in Germany in the 1930s, I get the feeling we've been here before. 70 years ago, and things haven't changed very much. One other point which I'd like to emphasize is the importance, if one's looking at privatization and restructuring in Europe, is that Russia and most of the former Soviet Union had no experience of market systems since 1917. So if one speaks to generations of people in Russia, they did not know what market systems were. Other Eastern European countries certainly had a better memory, but still it's something which was more theoretical than practical for them. Now, just looking at the experience, I'll do a very quick, rapid review of the European experiences of SOE reconstruction and privatization. And I would say I'll do this from a grassroots perspective, because my own role in state enterprise restructuring in Europe was not so much as a policy advisor, which is another role I have, but actually dealing with the turnaround strategies and studies at the enterprise level. So I spent a lot of time in the 80s and the 90s, and again more recently, in going around companies in Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Russia to a lesser extent, looking at ways in which those companies could be restructured and either privatized or, depending on the government policy, made more efficient until they could be privatized. So I'm coming to, from this program, from this perspective of the grassroots and the enterprise level. So I think if one's talking about privatization in Europe, it is of course obvious that one has to refer to the privatization launched by the Thatcher government after 1979 in UK. Other Western European countries followed that in 1982 onwards, but took a slower approach and a more partial approach than the dramatic, radical approach in UK. There's been a lot of discussion about what caused and what drove the UK privatization process. And there's been some discussion and suggestions that it was actually originally driven by ideology. However, the evidence is that in fact the first privatizations were driven not by ideology, but by the crisis in the public and the state enterprise finances in 1979, when Britain was, for technical purposes, bankrupt, not unlike New Zealand and several other countries, and had to make recourse to the IMF. And so the initial purpose was to rapidly raise funds to reduce government borrowing and sustain the public finances. Privatization was not included in the 1979 election manifesto proposed by Margaret Thatcher. And so it appeared to be something which was retrofitted initially rather than driven by policy and ideology. However, it is worth recalling that the concept had been explored by the Conservative Party back in the 1960s and the 1970s. That's the initial stage. The later stages, I would suggest, were very much driven by policy, ideology, whatever one likes to call it, and also by the urge for transactions. There was a business dynamic to have as many privatization transactions because it generated good fees for the financial sector and also achieved some of the policy objectives, which is to reduce the state, to liberalize the market, try and get greater efficiencies in the economy. Now, if one looks at the SOE reconstruction in the UK at that time, there were not many of the sort of instruments which we've been talking about, such as corporate governance, business strategy and preparations. The approach was very much on what you might broadly call structural adjustment. It was promotion of competition, particularly the unbundling of integrated monopoly companies and public service agencies. There was an assumption that by transferring ownership to the private sector, one would get much better operational efficiency because private sector managers are, by definition, it was assumed, more efficient than state enterprise manufacturers. However, there was also an extensive pre-privatization financial cleanup of the balance sheet. Some of the state enterprises had enormous debts. British Airways is a classic example, which had to be written off. Another key factor looking at the whole period of reconstruction was the reliance on the sector regulators, rather than corporate governance or other mechanisms, to ensure that the privatized enterprises operated in the public good and tried to deliver public benefits. So I won't go through many of the key points, but I just flag a few others from the UK experience, which is that, first of all, there was a decentralized privatization management program. It was not handled by a single organization, such as REAB or the Ministry of Privatization in other countries, but it was handled by the line ministries responsible for their particular sectors, but with careful overview and oversight by the Minister of Finance, the Treasury. Another point which I'd emphasize is the importance of the transitional costs, because that's one thing which frankly was pushed under the carpet, to look at the serious welfare and transitional costs in UK. How are they funded? North Sea oil. This is one of the matters which I take up with my colleagues working in the British government and said, what happened about transitional costs? And it was not looked at, not widely recognized, not analyzed, and not included. But I think if one's looking at reconstruction of SOEs, one needs to look at transitional costs. Any private sector manager does it. If we're looking at the private sector reconstruction, we certainly always look at transitional costs. In those days also, there was very little emphasis on corporate governance for privatized companies. One of the main reasons was that corporate governance was just coming to the fore in the wake of private sector scandals in the UK. There were some serious issues which leading to the Cadbury report. But corporate governance was not applied as a policy instrument in the UK in the early stages of privatization, nor indeed in the later stages. And I think that has resonance for the longer term, because one of the key problems facing UK state enterprises and private enterprises is the lack and the deficiencies in corporate governance. If I can very rapidly whiz over other Western European countries, we've had colleagues from other Western European countries here who've explained a little bit. So I would simply say that they tend to use similar instruments and have a similar program. I won't stretch that too far, but it was more partial and slower, not nearly as radical as in the UK. Turning now to Eastern Europe, I think it's very difficult to identify any common themes or clear patterns. One has to look at the country-specific histories, the economic commonalities, and international agency policies. Thank you. And it's only then when one drills down into the country level that one can really appreciate the changes which went through. So quickly looking at these, in Germany, in East Germany, it was the unification of East and West Germany which really pushed the drivers. In Russia, the political complications, we've heard a certain amount about the kleptocracy and the fact that the minimal experience of the state economy. Poland, there are serious political rivalries, I wouldn't call them complications, which made for a rather uncertain political environment. Hungary had already commenced major reforms going back to 1980. I remember going to Hungary in 1980 when the Hungarians were quite clear, we love Margaret Thatcher, we want to do everything she's doing here. And they started introducing some of her reforms in the early 1980s, way ahead of many of the other countries. Czech Republic and Slovakia, again, were regarded as pragmatic but had to move fast because they did not go through any previous reforms. Now, I think it's necessary to look at some of the commonalities, which is, it was assumed and it was evident that all the countries in Eastern Europe were directed to serving the former Soviet Union market, in particular the military industries. This skewed the industries and a lot of the agriculture in Eastern Europe. Also, one of the key features, the socialist economists had raised fairly high living standards, but they depended on debt and they were considered to be unsustainable. So, and one of the key features about those was that the state enterprises themselves, rather than the welfare state, provided many of the welfare programs. So as soon as one was restructuring and privatizing state enterprises, one was cutting out the welfare and the social safety net with fairly severe consequences. Now, you can see here, I've just run through a couple of examples. I won't go through the details. I think you have the chance to see the handouts. What I would say is that not in Russia, but in Hungary, Czech Republic, and many of the other Eastern European countries, the emphasis was not so much on state enterprise reconstruction, but on shock therapy, on modifying structure adjustment programs to modify and reform the policy environment. And that was there to ensure that the subsidies and the supports, which were no longer sustainable, would be cut away, and the enterprises had to live in that new reformed environment. So the biggest emphasis there was not so much on the reconstruction, but on the policy environment. So just gallop through with a few more examples there. I could like to quickly turn over to the purposes for privatization. And the key point here is that most countries had multiple purposes, but they're not necessarily clearly articulated, nor were they given any clear sense of priority. Therefore, that led to quite a lot of policy confusion, management confusion, and a lack of direction. There are numerous other purposes, which I think many of us know very well, for privatization. So just here I've got something of a checklist to see the sort of things which may be relevant. Finally, I'd just like to look at some of the generic policy instruments for privatization and restructuring in Eastern Europe, and in Western Europe, in fact. And one of the key points there is that through the whole reform program, private ownership was viewed as an automatic method of restructuring. I remember battles, I'm more than willing to say which side I am on the fence, battles with people who turn around and say, why bother to restructure this enterprise? Why bother to introduce these various these management instruments? Just privatize, change the ownership, all your problems will be solved. I didn't agree with that personally, but it's something for debate and discussion in this seminar. Could it all have been done better? Well, one thing which is a little too long to include, but I went through a list of 21 items, which are areas that I know from living through it in experience could have been done better, should have been done better, because they were known at the time. I think it illustrates the fact that we've still got a lot to learn and a lot to remember. Can I quickly also, finally, look at one of the issues? Where did this all lead us? Because at the end of the day, the bottom line for state enterprises and for development, what impact does it have on the citizens? What impact does it have on per capita income, GDP, and the Human Development Index? So thank you very much, UNDP. I cobbled together some of your trends, and so you can quickly see what was the progress in Western Europe. And you can see fairly smooth trend. India has had a fairly massive change in improvement. Some look at the countries there. Cyprus had an enormous blip because of the Turkish invasion back in 1971-72. Turning now to Eastern Europe, if one looks at this chart, this is trying to cover 40 countries or something, so it's a bit of a mess, but I think what it does show is the serious downturns in blips as a result of the restructuring reform program. Now, many of those have been picking up, and so I think those countries which actually moved ahead with reforms and restructuring, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Slovakia, have made progress and have gone back on their trend paths, if you're looking over the 40 years. Those countries which did not pursue proper reforms, Moldova, Belarus, Ukraine, have had a very hard time in getting back to where they were. So I think that's the message, that one's got to look at reform with the ultimate objective and seeing how reformers can improve the Human Development Index as an indicator, the welfare of the citizens, and the competitiveness of the state. So, Mr. Chairman, I think I may have overshot the time. I'm just using the reserve capital left behind by Philip Coe. Thank you very much. And look forward to any discussions which you might have. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Gillibrand. And the final but not the least speaker is Ms. Mariam Wissam. My note tells me she's from the Maldives. She is the Director General of the Pension Supervision Department of Maldives and has done pioneering work in promoting good governance in this island nation. Ms. Wissam, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting us for this conference on resurgence of SOEs. Before talking about the policy implementation and the Maldivian government's policy on SOEs, I would like to give a brief background about Maldives. Maldives consists of 1,190 islands, from which 200 islands are uninhabited. Around 330,000 people spread around these islands. Generally, doing business is not easy and not viable in 90% of the islands, where 6,000 to 8,000 people, due to difficulties in connectivity, live around, which means that 6,000 to 8,000 people usually live around in these 200 inhabited islands. The government attempts to establish this linkage for the connectivity of these islands through a transport system, SME financing, and mobile phone banking, which will link people and provide similar services to all but not necessarily from each island. The Maldivian islands and atolls are susceptible to natural disasters and environmental changes, and that has made the development task more challenging, especially in the context of open policy adopted by most of the authorities in Maldives. Being small and widespread, open trade has brought in numerous benefits as well as external shocks to our economy. Similarly, the islands are relatively closed in terms of financial flows, reflecting a lack of investment opportunities and capacity constraints in delivering financial services. In my presentation, I'm going to look at the government's policy for SOEs, and I'm also going to identify those areas which are open for business in Maldives. The government is basically looking at incorporating all the state-owned enterprises within these 6 to 8 months, and furthermore develop these SOEs and then go for privatization in the next 10 years. The Maldives is currently going through a period of progressive economic, social, and political transformation, and the government intends to deliver on its pledges to foster economic development through a more efficient system. Embarked on a process of regionalization and decentralization to reduce government bureaucracy and to increase the level of public participation and to enable a more people-centric and right-based approach to development by giving administrative authority to the recently created 7 administrative regions. In the Maldives, we used to have 19 divisions of the regions, which we used to call atolls, and the current government has decided to go forward with 7 provinces, and taking in this approach, a market-based approach to national development through regional development and decentralization has been pursued, which will facilitate the provision of services through the corporatization of existing facilities, the creation of joint public-private partnerships, and by seeking foreign direct investment. To date, we have around 40 state-owned enterprises, and the main areas for investment through the PPPs in these areas includes transportation, real estate, utilities, healthcare, education, regional airports, regional ports, as well as broadcasting and entertainment. I would like to give some insight to the nature of existing entities among the state-owned enterprises. We have 3 broad areas which are existing corporations, such as the airports company and the state electric company we have in Maldives. We have the newly formed companies, such as the regional utility companies. We have the non-corporate service providers, such as schools and hospitals. A number of new companies have already been established in order to facilitate the process of privatization. These will be 100% government-owned entities, state-owned entities. You must be wondering what's the role of the Capital Market Development Authority when it comes to state-owned enterprises and the whole government's policy on privatization. At the Capital Market Development Authority, we pioneer the Corporate Governance Code, and we have been promoting the corporate governance principles among the state-owned enterprises. Currently, 7 state-owned enterprises follow the Corporate Governance Code of Capital Market Development Authority, and at the Capital Market Development Authority, we also have a Capital Market and Corporate Governance Institute. Here we plan to provide a pool of professionals for the state-owned enterprises, such that we would have the best directors sitting at the boards of these state-owned enterprises. And furthermore, we are also in the process of establishing an institute for corporate directors and secretaries, and this is also to support the Government Strategic Action Plan on State-Owned Enterprises and Privatization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Vissam. So we've had 4 speakers who've spoken on various themes, starting with Dr. Igbuzor's broad developmental perspective on Africa, and in particular the role of state enterprises in that drive. We've had Mr. Philip Koh talk about the legal aspects of corporate governance, and very importantly stress the importance of governance itself and the governance process if you want to have successful state-owned enterprises. We've also had a history of state-owned enterprises and of recent restructuring in Eastern Europe by Mr. Gillibrand, and he's also very interestingly pointed out to us, whatever it is, the bottom line is actually human development. So very often you may have successful state-owned enterprises but not much human development, and vice versa. So I think it's quite important to bear that in mind. And finally, we've just had from Ms. Vissam an account of the Trust on Development in Maldives, using very interestingly a market-based approach. So we have a nice conspectus of histories here, and now we go on to listen to our discussants, the first of whom is Professor Ranjit Bandara. Professor Bandara is the chairman of the Sri Lanka Foundation. He's also Senior Economic Advisor, Strategic Enterprise Management Agency, or SIMA, and member of various prestigious institutions in Sri Lanka. He's also a member in the board of directors of leading banks and financial institutions in Sri Lanka. Ranjit.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am pleased to note that the government of Kerala is setting examples of managing state-owned enterprises effectively to the rest of the world, particularly the countries in the so-called developing world. Now, since in the morning many have noted that the privatization of state-owned enterprises has influenced by the neo-liberal economic policy, which advocated by the international organizations such as IMF and the World Bank. However, in my opinion, the people and the institution have involved with the privatization of state-owned enterprises have failed to take into account. Mr. Gilbert, in his presentation, have noted quite a few times. However, worth mentioning once again the welfare contribution of the SOEs. And also, we have failed to take into account non-financial contribution by the state-owned enterprises in many parts of the world. And again, inadequate attention